the nuclear plane that almost ended aviation forever. A deep metallic roar shakes the desert floor. Above, a massive bomber cuts through the sky, carrying something far more dangerous than bombs, a live nuclear reactor. Scientists in white suits watch nervously from bunkers miles away as the aircraft circles overhead. They've actually done it. The US Air Force has flown a nuclear-powered plane, even if only for a moment. But this isn't fiction, it really happened. And while America was doing this, the Soviet Union was scheming to beat them to the same terrifying goal, a plane that could fly forever. It was the ultimate Cold War fantasy, endless range, unstoppable power, and possibly the fastest way to end civilization. This is the story of the nuclear plane that almost ended aviation forever. A story so bizarre it flips between brilliance, paranoia, and dark comedy. Because in the Cold War, humanity didn't just test bombs, we tested common sense. The Cold War, fever dream. In the uneasy calm after World War II, two new superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, glared across a divided world. Both had atomic bombs, and both were terrified of falling behind. Fear became the great motivator, and one word seemed to promise the answer to every worry: nuclear. By the late 1940s, nuclear meant progress and power at once. It lit up propaganda screens and haunted public imagination. If atomic energy could light cities and sink submarines, why not make it fly? The idea of an airplane that never needed to land felt like a miracle until you remembered what it carried. In theory, the pitch was seductively simple. A nuclear-powered plane could roam the skies for days or weeks, impossible to intercept and always ready to strike. If one side achieved it, the other could never rest. That insecurity set the stage for a race built on mutual paranoia. In the United States, it took shape as the aircraft nuclear propulsion program. In the Soviet Union, it emerged under other names within the Tupolev Design Bureau. Both chased the same fantasy: infinite range, ultimate deterrence, zero restraint. Politicians on both sides sold the dream as strength. In America, safety drills and shimmering newsreels turned nuclear power into patriotic showmanship. In the USSR, propaganda films promised a glorious atomic future. Somewhere between pride and fear, the line between progress and recklessness disappeared. The same idea that promised peace also threatened annihilation if even one wing failed. Across deserts in New Mexico and frozen steppes in Kazakhstan, scientists tested the same madness from opposite horizons. Each side imagined the other was already ahead. Each was wrong. What neither admitted aloud was the simplest truth of all: every machine that flies must someday fall, and when your engine is a reactor, falling isn't an option. They didn't know it yet, but the coming experiments would bring them perilously close to finding out how far that fall could go. The American nuclear plane program begins. The United States didn't just dream of the nuclear airplane, it actually tried to build one. The program had an official name, the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Initiative, or ANP. To those who worked on it, it was equal parts engineering marvel and occupational hazard. Created in the early 195s under the joint sponsorship of the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission, ANP promised to deliver a plane that could roam the globe non-stop, refueling only on coffee and optimism. At its core, ANP pursued two main paths. One aimed to design a real nuclear-powered jet engine that could heat incoming air directly with a reactor. The other, more cautious path, focused on simply putting a working reactor in the air to see what would happen. That second one sounded safer on paper until it came time to actually do it. The result was a modified B-36 bomber named the NB-36H Crusader. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a flying laboratory for humankind's overconfidence. From the outside, the Crusader looked like a standard bomber, sleek, silvery, and menacingly huge. Inside, it was a different story. The bomb bay had been replaced with a small nuclear reactor. Engineers called it the test reactor, though there was nothing small about it except the amount of shielding that separated it from the pilots. The idea was to study how radiation behaved in flight, how it scattered through the fuselage, and whether a nuclear aircraft could ever be made safe. The answer would soon become apparent. Radiation shielding was a nightmare. To protect the six-person crew from exposure, engineers essentially built a bunker inside the cockpit. They lined it with 12 tons of lead and rubber, creating what looked like a futuristic cave on wings. The windshield was made from 18 inches of leaded glass. The joke among the crew was that if the plane ever had to make an emergency landing, no one would see the runway in time. Too much protection, not enough visibility. Still, the Air Force needed data, and the Crusader was humanity's bravest, or most expendable, test subject. Each flight carried a certain grim tension. Before takeoff, teams in white coats and Geiger counters checked for leaks and tightened bolts that no one wanted to wiggle loose. The reactor wasn't actually connected to the engines, it wasn't powering the plane, but it was live, humming with fission inside its shielded pod. As the engines roared and the plane lifted from the desert tarmac, everyone on the ground knew exactly what was at stake. If anything went wrong, the crash site would glow for 100,000 years. The test routes were carefully selected over sparsely populated areas of Texas and New Mexico. Even then, residents occasionally spotted the enormous silver bomber and wondered why it flew escorted by fighter jets that never let it out of sight. The answer was simple. If the nuclear plane went down, those fighters were the first line of cleanup, a job nobody wanted. Inside the cockpit, crew members worked in tight quarters, surrounded by shielding that trapped heat and blocked most radio signals. Communication was difficult, and so was breathing. Air circulated through filters while dosimeters clipped to their suits clicked constantly. At first, the background radiation level seemed acceptable. After just a few flights, however, instruments showed trace contamination in areas that were supposed to be sealed. No one said the quiet part out loud. They were sitting feet away from an active reactor 30,000 feet above the ground. The Air Force logbooks describe a series of 50-odd flights between 1955 and 1957. Officially, all went according to plan. Unofficially, engineers were alarmed by how unpredictable the readings were. Radiation didn't behave like fuel or thrust, it behaved like a stubborn ghost, sneaking through microscopic seams, bouncing around compartments, and refusing to stay put. Shielding could be increased, but every extra pound of protection meant less lift, less range, less logic behind the idea of a plane that could supposedly fly forever. Meanwhile, secrecy cloaked everything. Newspapers reported vague hints of nuclear flight experiments, though details remained buried under security classifications. Even among those working on the project, few saw the complete picture. Technicians handling reactor components were told only enough to do their part. Exposure reports were filed privately. In an era when nuclear enthusiasm was patriotic, admitting fear felt like treason. The culture of the time rewarded optimism and punished doubt. Congressional committees toured the facilities, dazzled by models of atomic engines mounted on polished stands. Generals spoke of strategic supremacy, of planes that would never need to land. Nobody wanted to be the one pointing out that if such a plane crashed, there might not be a country left to defend. Test pilots joked through their nerves with gallows humor. They'd walk out to the plane saying, "Let's hope today's weather holds and the uranium stays inside." The engineers kept battling the same equation, weight versus safety. To shield the entire aircraft effectively would require several hundred tons of lead, more than the plane could possibly lift. Reducing the shielding meant higher radiation doses for everyone aboard and potential contamination of everything below the flight path. It was like trying to design a campfire that wouldn't burn anything while roasting marshmallows with a flamethrower. Despite the flaws, ANP's momentum continued. Defense contractors competed for contracts, each promising lighter, more efficient reactors. Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, and Convair all joined the atomic gold rush. Laboratories in Ohio and Idaho worked day and night, building test cores and experimental heat exchangers. Every small improvement rekindled hope that the impossible might still be just barely possible. After all, if the Soviets managed it first, America would look weak, a risk politicians refused to accept. By the late 50s, internal reviews told a different story. The costs were astronomical, the schedule unrealistic, and the risk uncontainable. Even if they could perfect the engine, how would they test an aircraft powered by an unshielded reactor without irradiating half the planet? No one had a satisfying answer. Some suggested launching it from remote islands or keeping it over the ocean, but crashes still happen. The dream of endless flight was colliding with the messy reality of gravity. Still, the story wasn't over. Buried inside the ANP reports were ideas that in hindsight make the nuclear bomber look almost sane. Concepts like a missile powered by a reactor, capable of flying indefinitely and dropping hydrogen bombs one after another, started floating through laboratories. The thinking was, if putting people next to a nuclear engine is too risky, maybe remove the people. let the weapon fly itself. It sounded efficient, also horrifying. By the time the NB-36H Crusader was mothballed, it had proved one undeniable fact. Flying with a reactor was possible, but surviving it long-term was not. The engineers had their data, the Air Force had its proof, and the scientific community had its doubts confirmed. Yet instead of using that as a stopping point, planners saw a doorway to something even more extreme. One classified memo described the next step as a nuclear-powered cruise missile with unlimited range. That proposal would evolve into Project Pluto, a creation so outrageous that even the engineers half-joked it existed to test whether ethics had an off switch. The reactor plane had only flirted with catastrophe. The next program would court it directly. And if you thought a crude bomber carrying a live reactor sounded bad, what came next redefined the word unstoppable in the worst possible way. Inside the reactor, engineering madness. Try to picture a jet engine, multiply its temperature by a few million degrees, and remove every component that resembles sanity. That's more or less what the nuclear engineers of the 195s were attempting. Nuclear propulsion, in theory, was dazzlingly simple. Instead of burning jet fuel, you let atomic fission do the heating. The reactor's core would get so hot that air rushing through the engine would expand violently, shooting out the back and pushing the plane forward. No gasoline, no refueling, just an airborne barbecue running on uranium. On whiteboards, it looked like genius. In real life, it looked like an extinction-level hazard wrapped in metal. A normal jet engine swallows air, compresses it, mixes it with fuel, and ignites it. The explosion creates thrust, and everything repeats thousands of times per second. Replace the burning fuel with the heat of a reactor, and you skip the middleman. It's like running a hairdryer with a volcano instead of electricity. Early designs divided into two main types, one where a conventional turbine circulated heat from the reactor, and another where the incoming air passed directly through the nuclear core. The first avoided radiation leaks but was heavy. The second was lighter, more powerful, and catastrophically unsafe. Engineers debated both over endless chalk dust and coffee. They called the concept direct cycle propulsion, which sounds tidy until you remember that the cycle involved blasting radioactive air directly into the sky. Every molecule of exhaust would carry a gentle glow, not the romantic kind, the emergency evacuation kind. On paper, the direct cycle engine offered incredible efficiency. In practice, it promised a trail of airborne fallout extending along the flight path wherever the plane went. Even the test models on the ground needed elaborate containment domes to keep the desert from becoming a Superfund site. Yet the optimism never fully dimmed. The problem, scientists argued, wasn't the physics, it was the engineering. They convinced themselves that if they could just shrink the reactor core enough, design better shielding, and find materials that didn't melt at 2,000 degrees Celsius, everything would fall into place. But every solution spawned new absurdities. To fit inside a bomber, the reactor had to be miniature, but miniaturization meant higher radiation density. To block that radiation, you added shielding. But weight increased, lift vanished, and the circle of impossibility completed itself. Inside laboratories, mock-ups hummed under thick layers of containment metal. Radiation monitors clicked constantly. Anyone entering the test cell wore a film badge to track exposure, like a personal scoreboard of how close they were to glowing. To cool down components, technicians sometimes used liquid sodium. Great for heat transfer, disastrous when leaked, since it burst into flames on contact with air. The scene could have been mistaken for a steampunk fever dream. Pipes dripping coolant, scientists in lead aprons, dials twitching with invisible energy. When faced with questions about safety, project leaders offered pragmatic optimism. They argued that every new frontier carried risk, that's why it was called a frontier. But privately, the memos sounded less heroic. Reports from Idaho test facilities described unexpected radiological anomalies, a bureaucratic euphemism for dangerous radiation leaks. One engineer later recalled how a single misaligned valve released contaminated air across the workspace. They scrubbed everything down and kept working. It was too early in the Cold War to let caution win. If all this sounds slightly absurd, remember the political background. Funding and jobs depended on showing progress. A reactor that merely glowed safely in a hangar didn't justify billions of dollars. They needed data, airflow patterns, heat gradients, dose rates. So they ran small-scale experiments where superheated radioactive gas whooshed through experimental nozzles. The results looked promising until sensors showed radiation levels that make a Geiger counter sing like a jazz soloist. Publicly, the tests were called encouraging. Privately, they were terrifying. Still, enthusiasm thrived under the banner of national necessity. If we don't do it, the Soviets will, became the unofficial motto. The paradox was that technically, both sides kept assuming the other was farther ahead. Spy reports misinterpreted prototypes as functioning planes, pushing each country to build faster and test harder. What started as a quest for endurance morphed into a contest of who could outrun common sense. The biggest unsolved issue was what happened in the event of a crash. A conventional bomber hitting the ground was tragic but localized. A nuclear-powered bomber breaking apart meant scattering several thousand pounds of radioactive material across miles of landscape. Imagine an emergency response manual that begins with, Step 1, evacuate half the continent. That was the level of absurdity engineers faced whenever they ran simulation. Even accidents on the runway could contaminate personnel, soil, and nearby water sources. And yet, each report seemed to underplay the danger. Every scientist knew the golden rule. The faster you deliver good news, the longer your project stays funded. One internal review brainstormed potential fail-safes. Could the reactor automatically seal itself upon impact? Maybe it could drop into a containment shell midair. One draft even proposed an emergency parachute for the reactor core, a flying coffin slowly descending, humming as it cooled. Nothing workable emerged, mostly because the physics refused to cooperate with optimism. At the end of the day, atoms didn't care about patriotism. By 1958, the technical teams had achieved what bureaucrats called proof of principle. Yes, a nuclear reactor could theoretically power a jet engine. The problem was everyone would die horribly if it did. That line didn't fit easily into a progress report, so they framed it the old-fashioned way: additional research required. Programs were extended, facilities expanded, and test stands multiplied, because admitting defeat cost more politically than radiation ever could. Engineers who truly understood the magnitude of the danger started quitting quietly for safer work, like reactor projects buried in submarines. Naval propulsion, at least, involved heavy shielding and stable water all around. If something went wrong underwater, it stayed relatively contained. In the air, gravity guaranteed chaos. The remaining teams pushed onward, proud, tired, and increasingly aware that they were treading technological quicksand. They tried to innovate their way out using lighter composites and experimental shielding materials. Layers of boron, polyethylene, and tungsten were tested like cosmic onions, each peel aiming to stop another particle. But radiation is sneaky. Neutrons slipped through cracks, reflected off surfaces, and found new paths to leak out. The dream of a perfectly sealed flying reactor drifted farther away with every attempted fix. Somewhere along the way, the pursuit changed tone. What began as patriotic discovery evolved into a grim wager against catastrophe. At government hearings, generals promised success within 5 years. Engineers inside knew those 5 years would bring nothing but fresh ulcers and stronger coffee. One scientist later put it best: every calculation proved the concept could work. Every experiment proved we shouldn't. And yet the project lived on long enough to inspire an even stranger sequel. If a manned reactor plane caused unbearable risk, maybe the answer was to remove the humans entirely. Let a nuclear engine fly an unmanned weapon instead of an aircraft. Robots didn't need shielding or breathing air. They wouldn't mind the radiation. That's how rationalization happens. One problem solved by inventing an even worse one. By the end of the decade, whispers around the laboratories spoke of a missile so powerful it could circle the globe, unleashing constant fury. The crash scenario wouldn't matter because it wasn't supposed to come home at all. Nuclear propulsion, stripped of purpose as transportation, would become a tool of pure destruction. And so, out of the ashes of every failed test run, one monstrous idea rose unchallenged. They called it Project Pluto, a flying reactor designed not to conquer distance, but to erase it. The nuclear airplane had proved human ingenuity could outthink reason. Project Pluto was proof we still wanted to try. Project Pluto, the flying reactor that never stopped. If the nuclear bomber seemed reckless, the next step made it look almost reasonable. Project Pluto wasn't about flight in any familiar sense. It was about creating a weapon that redefined the word overkill. The goal: a missile that never needed to land, never needed refueling, and could cross the planet spewing radiation while dropping hydrogen bombs along the way. It wasn't deterrence anymore. It was apocalypse on autopilot. The weapon had a proper name, the Supersonic Low Altitude Missile, or SLAM, and it sounded precisely as terrifying as it was. The concept came together in 1957 under the U.S. Air Force and the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory at Livermore. If successful, SLAM would carry up to 16 nuclear warheads and travel at 3 times the speed of sound, hugging the ground at treetop level to dodge radar. Inside its lengthy fuselage sat the beating heart of the project. A ramjet engine powered not by kerosene or fuel, but by an unshielded nuclear reactor roaring at thousands of degrees. A ramjet, in theory, is brutally simple. You use the plane's own speed to compress incoming air, heat it, and blast it out the tail for thrust. Replace conventional combustion with uranium fission, and you have a missile that can fly for days or weeks without stopping. The Air Force loved that part. Unlimited range meant they could launch from anywhere, circle the globe multiple times, and strike on command. The problem was everything else. The engineers quickly realized they were inventing a weapon that polluted the planet as it flew. Because the reactor had no shielding, every second of flight meant streaming hot radioactive gases into the atmosphere. The missile would leave behind an invisible trail of contamination wherever it went, an airborne Chernobyl decades before anyone knew that name. Livermore physicists privately joked that the Earth itself was its real target. The humor was dark, because nobody could fully admit how unethical the concept was, even to each other. On paper, the performance numbers looked impossible to ignore. The projected range was over 100,000 miles, enough to orbit the planet several times. It could carry 50,000 pounds of nuclear ordnance, making even the heaviest bombers look dainty by comparison. Each SLAM could cover multiple strike points across the Soviet Union, then crash into a final target with its own last thermonuclear detonation. The term overcapacity didn't apply. This was the military-industrial version of a nervous breakdown. Yet, despite the moral absurdity, the project gathered momentum. Livermore's site in Nevada became a testing ground for the new nuclear ramjet engine, codenamed Tory. Engineers built massive concrete bunkers and miles of underground piping to simulate high-speed airflow. The first working core, Tory IIA, was tested in 1961. It performed for a few seconds, just long enough to roar, glow, and remind everyone that they were messing with something better suited for a science fiction villain. When Tory IIC followed 2 years later, the monster came to life more convincingly. On a spring day in 1964, engineers at Jackass Flats, yes, that was the real name of the test range, brought the engine online. As the air compressors flooded the ramjet with oxygen and the uranium fuel began to fission, the desert trembled. Witnesses described an ear-splitting howl, the kind of deep mechanical scream that makes your chest vibrate. The engine produced its predicted thrust. In pure physics terms, it was a triumph. In moral terms, it was an unmitigated disaster. The reactor heated air to thousands of degrees, blasting it out the exhaust nozzles in a torrent of invisible radiation. Even though it sat bolted to the ground, everyone present knew that if it ever went airborne, nothing beneath its flight path would stay untainted. Every cow, crop, and breath of air could become slightly radioactive. One technician later said that just standing near the test stand felt wrong, like staring at a volcano you accidentally built. The Air Force, balancing patriotism with denial, kept calling it feasible. Some even argued that since a nuclear war would already blanket the planet with fallout, the SLAM's extra pollution wouldn't matter. That logic did little to reassure the people expected to operate or clean up after it. Despite efficient containment on test days, small particles of activated dust still escaped the site. The desert winds did the rest. Officially, everything stayed within safe limit. Unofficially, engineers went home smelling faintly of ozone and guilt. What truly made Project Pluto chilling was how strategic necessity overpowered ethics. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction meant both sides sought weapons that guaranteed annihilation even after being attacked. SLAM was the perfect manifestation of that idea, indestructible, autonomous, merciless. If Soviet missiles wiped out America's silos, the Pluto missiles could still launch and erase the enemy in return. That made it, on paper, the ultimate deterrent. The catch was simple. It could also end civilization by existing. Decision-makers seemed caught between fascination and dread. President Kennedy's advisors joked nervously about the flying reactor, but they kept funding it. Congress approved budgets with patriotic speeches about technological supremacy, as if radiation was a symbol of freedom. Livermore scientists, meanwhile, struggled with the psychological burden of success. To build a machine that worked perfectly meant creating something fundamentally evil. Each design challenge bordered on absurd. How do you test flight performance without irradiating the sky? One proposal suggested launching slams over the South Pacific and letting them circle until fuel exhaustion. Another wanted to guide them over remote Arctic regions before self-destructing in midair. The problem was the fuel exhaustion part. There was no fuel to run out of. A nuclear engine doesn't stop until it melts. The project's theoretical solutions all concluded with variations of hope it crashes in the ocean. Even handling the missile on the ground was nightmarish. Assembly crews would be exposed to neutron flux within minutes. Maintenance required robotic arms and remote cranes. The launchers needed reinforced silos capable of venting radioactive exhaust into containment systems. Every safety measure canceled out the supposed simplicity that made SLAM appealing. The longer the project went on, the more it looked like trying to weaponize natural disaster. Still, Cold War competition blazed like a fever. Rumors circulated that the Soviets had their own nuclear-powered cruise missile in development.